Thursday. This morning, we are finishing the book of Exodus, Vayakel Pekude, which are the last two parshiot of the book of Exodus. And these two parshiot are sometimes combined, sometimes not, but this Shabbat they are combined. It has entirely to do with the schedule of the year and of the month. And so what we're going to do is to look at Vayakel Pekude together, and they do help us understand certain things that apart are a little bit less clear, I think, in terms of the overall message that the Torah is bringing to us. And Vayakel, which means gathering, is a wonderful title for us to have at this point in our pandemic history, since gathering is, of course, what we, God willing, are about to do with one another. And this sense of community that is implicit in Vayakel is the beginning of a theme of Jewish communal life that becomes incredibly important in Jewish history. As you may know, the distinction in some ways between the Jewish tradition and other traditions, in some ways, is that Judaism tends to be at least as much, sometimes more, about belonging than believing. And Vayakel, which means gathering, is an early example of this continuous tendency in the Jewish tradition to emphasize the community and the people. Now, I want to talk essentially about two different themes, both of which are prominent in the text that we have before us. The first is the Mishkan, and the second is the Shabbat. And there is a lot of debate about why the two of them are put together, and I hope to at least cast a little bit of light on that subject while also talking about something broader and larger. But let's first start with Shabbat. If I tell you that you're not allowed to do any work on Shabbat, you might be confused, because you'll say, well, why can't I tear paper, which isn't to me work? And why am I allowed to carry books from one room to the other, which to me is work? And you realize that the Hebrew melacha does not correspond to the English work. Sometimes it's written as labors, but again, what about people who, traditionally you're not allowed to draw or write on Shabbat. What about people who say, but I find it restful to draw, so I should be able to do that on Shabbat? Well, one of the connections between the Mishkan, that is the sanctuary, and the Shabbat is that the text tells us that all of the work on the Mishkan stopped on Shabbat. And therefore, the rabbis extrapolated what was involved in building the Mishkan, and they came up with 39 separate labors, malachot, 39 separate malachot that are then prohibited on Shabbat. So if you ask, why are the prohibitions what they are, the origin has to do with the building of the Mishkan. And that already ties together two seemingly disparate topics. The Shabbat and the Mishkan. Remember, the Mishkan is the tabernacle. That is sort of the traveling altar. The Shabbat and the Mishkan, those two are tied together by the fact that the Mishkan gives us our standard prohibitions that we observe on the Sabbath. And so the connection between the two is in part a legal connection. But there are deeper connections between the two that are worth thinking about. And in particular, one that I think is sort of at the very bottom of this, that's one of those deeply theological and psychological and personal ideas that Judaism offers that I think we should understand and explore. But before we get to that third step, let's go a second step. The Mishkan and the Shabbat are related in a different way, which is, and this would require a little bit of showing you verbal affinities between the two, which I don't need to do at the moment, but you can take a look if you want to later on, which is that the language of building the Mishkan has a lot of echoes of the language of creation. And so in some sense, you're building what's called a microcosm. That is a little fortified, manageable, almost bite-sized model of the vast cosmos. And when you focus and sacrifice on the Mishkan, it is a way of paying tribute to the creation that God made. And therefore the Shabbat, which is, after all, the crown of creation and the culmination of creation, is part of the Mishkan because you don't offer the sacrifices on Shabbat. And it's when you cease from the work of the Mishkan, you are at the same time affirming the connection between the Mishkan and the creation of the world, since God ceases in the creation of the world. And remember that we talked about last week, it's not that God is in the Mishkan, right? It says, build me a house, v'shachanti b'tocham, and I'll dwell among you. It's rather that through the activity of the Mishkan, God dwells among the people. But that reality that God's indwelling exists as a result of their devotion to the Mishkan enables this connection between creation and the tabernacle. Now, finally, let's get to what is, I think, the most interesting of the steps that I want to take, and that is the idea of sacrifice in general, just sacrifice. I want to start off by defending the notion of sacrifice in a way that I have many times before, which is to say, the primary difference, most of the sacrifices were eaten, not all of them, but most of them were eaten. And the primary difference between sacrifice in the ancient temple or on the Mishkan and meat today is that there is no sense of sanctity when we kill animals and wrap them up in cellophane and sell them at the meat counter. The same thing happened in ancient times, but there was a sense of awe and a recognition of taking a life and prayers and an entire ceremony that ritualized and sanctified the same thing that we do without ritual and without sanctity. So when people say how barbaric it was that they sacrificed animals, the truth is we do the same thing. It's just that we do it by billions, since billions of cows and chickens each year are slaughtered to sate our carnivorous appetites. I say that with a little bit of judgment as a vegetarian, just a little tiny bit. And it's the same thing, except that in ancient times, they did it in a very different way. So that being the case, now let's talk about what sacrifice means. You sacrifice to God, it is important to say, not because God needs sacrifice. God doesn't need sacrifice. You sacrifice to God because if the sacrifice does something for the individual, for the person. And therefore, we have to ask, what does it mean that this sacrifice is given to God? And what does it mean? What does it do for you? And I think that everybody of a certain level of self-awareness and maturity knows why a sacrifice in Hebrew is called a korban, literally a drawing close. Because when you sacrifice for someone, you feel closer to them. even though psychodynamically you might think that the process works the other way, that you sacrifice for this person and you're just done with them, but that's not how it works. In fact, there's an old saying, which is, if you want to find somebody to help you, find somebody who's done you a favor. Because somehow doing a favor for someone else ties you to them, even though in theory it should really tie them to you, which it also does somewhat. But it is amazing. I mean, this is part of the bond, I'm convinced, that parents have with children, is you've given so much to them that you have an investment because of your sacrifice. And each sacrifice ties you closer, and that's why it's called a korban, a drawing close. And therefore, part of the foundation of genuine relationship is sacrifice. You give nothing up, you're not close. Therefore, part of the question of a genuine connection, friendship, love, is to ask yourself, what have I given to this person? And the more you've given, the more that's an indication of your intimacy. Now, is this a perfect rule that follows? I mean, can you write in Facebook, but I know an exception of this? Of course. Such interpersonal and psychodynamic rules are never 100%. But generally, this is true, and it's certainly the way the sacrifice works in the Torah, where it tells Israel that you shall sacrifice for these various things, and sacrifice is a constant accompaniment of worship. And when the temple is destroyed, long after, obviously, where we are in the Torah, sacrifice becomes avodah shebalev, sacrifice of the heart, that is prayer. That when you pray, you are supposed to give up of yourself, because it's the same kind of drawing close. The imbalance that exists in the world, the imbalance that exists in relationships, the constant shifting of people's needs and people's haves, sacrifice is in part intended to redress that balance. Why are there sin offerings? Why are there thanksgiving offerings? Because somebody feels a sense of sin and needs to rebalance themselves. They feel a sense of gratitude and they need to express the gratitude and rebalance themselves. So that the sacrifice is a means of restoring equilibrium and a kind of pursuit of inner peace. You know how it can be that this will bother you and bother you and bother you, and then finally you will do it and you'll feel okay. And the same thing, that same dynamic is repeated constantly in the desire to sacrifice. I want to give, I feel like I should, I've given, now I feel okay. The gift has been received, I'm good. That's a really important understanding of what a sacrifice entails in the temple, in the Mishkan, which is sort of the traveling temple in a way, and also in interpersonal life. Now, once that has been established, okay, remember that the overarching question that we asked is, why is the Sabbath mentioned right after the tabernacle? Why are the two juxtaposed without the Torah telling us what one has to do with the other? I would suggest that, among other things, the reason that the Sabbath is in there is because this deep need and quest for some measure of inner peace, and I'm not suggesting that the Torah is giving you a way of feeling good all the time. God knows that's neither the Torah's intent nor the way that any Jew has ever felt in history. As a friend of mine likes to say, with only slight exaggeration, a sad Jew is a happy Jew. But you get the idea, which is that just as the sacrifice is a means of restoring the equilibrium in the community and your relationship to God and your relationship to your own soul, so is Shabbat. Shabbat, first of all, let us not kid ourselves, is partly a sacrifice. If you really observe Shabbat, there are things you cannot do. There are things that you forbid yourself from doing. And even though you may say it's not a sacrifice to put this aside for 24 hours, 25 hours, the truth is, on one level it is, which is why not everybody does it or doesn't do it easily. And yet it is also that kind of sacrifice in search of peace, that it allows you a calm inside yourself. If Shabbat is successful, that is very hard to achieve on all the other days of the week when, as the poet puts it, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Whereas on Shabbat, you in fact have the opportunity to breathe, to pause, to enable yourself to reset your internal dials and monitors, and to feel a certain harmony and sense of ease with the universe that is also the aim of sacrifice. And so I think on a deep psychological, spiritual level, the Mishkan and the Shabbat are tied together. And they're put together at the end of the book of Exodus. Why? At the end of the book of Exodus, because up until now, the Jews have been completely unable to practice either of these things. You're slaves in Egypt, which means you do not control your own time, which means you do not control your own Shabbat. That's clear. And your sacrifice, such as it is totally involuntary and unremitting, right? Being a slave is leading a life of almost total sacrifice all the time. That's not the kind of sacrifice that balances you. And in fact, it just occurs to me as I'm saying this, that to enable slaves to offer sacrifices to God is a way of saying to them, you have something to offer, to willingly offer, to offer from your heart, right? Chokhmat lev and nediv lev, these are the words that are used. Wise of heart and giving of heart and so on. You have something to offer that God wishes, and therefore you actually can rebalance your internal by your own volition, not by the mandate of a slave master, but by your own volition, you can rebalance yourself. And therefore, we are ready now, beginning next week with Leviticus, which is all about sacrifices in different ways. We are ready now to move through the wilderness and to understand that the wilderness will allow the Israelites to explore both of these means of coming to terms with who they are, both sacrifice and Shabbat. Okay, now I know we have a few questions. Yes, right. There is a similarity, as Jim says, between what you pay for dearly, you value. And I can't tell you how many times we've had various programs at the synagogue and we've said, should we make people pay for them? Should we not make people pay for them? And someone will always say, if they don't pay anything, then it'll seem like it's not as valuable a program. And that's always a question. When you ask people to pay and they do pay, then they tend to value things, as every psychological study shows, more. So the question of wants versus needs in balance and equilibrium, I don't even know how to begin to address such a complicated question that I think differs with each human being. But I would say then the sacrifice is a need. That doesn't mean that it's always fulfilled. Not all our needs are fulfilled, but I think it's a deep psychological need. I can't imagine a person or a society that does not exist without both a sense of sacrifice and some kind of practice of sacrifice. And the the idea of the sacrifice, remember that this, when we're told that you're supposed to give something without an expectation of receiving, it's talking tangible benefits. It doesn't say you shouldn't feel good about the fact that you give. And your internal sense of giving, what it does for you inside yourself, that I think is the whole point of it. When the Talmud says schar mitzvah mitzvah, the reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah, it is the sense of doing a mitzvah. And the same thing with sacrifice. When you give to your children, do you do it so that they will support you in your old age? No. But do you get something out of it? Of course you do. You get a sense that you're doing something that is consistent with who you are, that you are in fact reinforcing your own character by doing something that makes you who you are. So thank you, by the way, for that, Graham, about he says he's reminded of the Native American principle of apologizing to an animal each time you kill a buffalo. So I would say, yeah, the idea that we owe an apology for taking a life is it's kind of a beautiful idea. And yes, as Deborah says, I mean, one of the ways that I've seen this over and over again is parents taking care of a sick child, and even more, children taking care of sick parents. Those of you, by the way, this is a little bit off the topic, but those of you who didn't see it, is I wrote a column a little while ago about the psychologist Winnicott has a very famous idea, the good enough mother. And you know, the way in which parents don't actually have to be perfect. They just have to provide for the basic physical, psychological needs of children, because there will always be things that will get wrong. And so he talks about the good enough mother. And I've seen so many children beat themselves up about how they've taken care of or not taken care of their parents, that I realized we also need a concept of the good enough child. You actually don't have to be the perfect caretaker to older parents. You have to do your best to make sure they're provided for in their basic ways, and so on and so forth. And there's the relationship of parent to child is so fraught in so many, even the most loving and perfect one. In so many ways, there's so many psychological levels of which we are not aware, that I think we have a tendency to be very, very hard on ourselves. But if you're a loving and caring child, no, you won't. You can't perfectly care for a parent, just as a parent can't perfectly care for a child. And mistakes are inevitably a part of it, which, again, to circle back to the theme, the fact that mistakes are inevitably a part of it is one of the reasons why we have sacrifice. And one of the themes that I know we're going to talk about next week, because I'm already exploring in the literature, is why you have to give sacrifices for things that you did inadvertently, as opposed to deliberate sins, right? If you do something and you don't realize it's a sin, or you didn't think it was a sin, or you didn't realize you were doing it, or so on, why is there still a sacrifice for that? And I'm not going to take any questions about that, because we're going to talk about it at great length next week. But it does tie into this idea once you open the notion of sacrifice. So let me just spend a couple more minutes about Shabbat before we close. And the reason I do it is because Shabbat is woven through the entire Torah. It's mentioned on many, many different occasions in many different contexts with many different ideas attached to it. But the prevailing overarching picture that we get from the Torah is that Shabbat is in some ways woven into the fabric of the universe. And because God stops creation on the seventh day, and therefore creates something by not creating. And that's a really important concept, that cessation is also a positive creation, and that not doing is a kind of doing, and that there is no total negation. Shabbat is not a day on which we do not do things. Shabbat is a day in which we create certain things by not doing other things. And that notion, the kind of gathering, for example, that we have on Shabbat, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, that kind of gathering doesn't exist on other days, because you create it by the various kinds of fences that you put up around laws of Shabbat. And so there is, in building the Mishkan, also a kind of building of Shabbat that seems a little bit at odds with the notion that you don't do anything on Shabbat, you don't work on Shabbat, but you do in that sense, because marking off territory within which your soul can live and thrive, that is also doing something. And so I really do urge you, think about something that preoccupies you during the week. I mean, maybe it's your phone, maybe it's something else that you could eliminate for a Shabbat and see how it feels. Or if you don't like candles, to light candles and see how it feels. In other words, do something, give a little sacrifice, see how the Shabbat feels given that. And also, of course, join us for Shabbat morning services. You should do that too. This week, it's Shabbat Morning Live with Craig Calvin. It'll be musical and it'll be delightful and I hope inspiring. But also create a Shabbat that will help change the way you inhabit the world, even when Shabbat is over. That's also part of what it means at the end of Exodus, when it's Vayakhel and Pekudei, is that we really do live in a world in which we don't have to sacrifice the same way that our ancestors did, but that basic human impulse to sacrifice in order to elevate oneself still exists. And so does the basic human impulse to turn off things that don't need to intrude on your life and consciousness every day, all day. That exists too. And so I hope you will. And thank you for joining me. And happy Thursday. And soon, Shabbat Shalom. And we also, don't forget, very soon, we'll be talking Pesach. Very soon.